So welcome to the first webinar in our Life Sciences Fall series. Today's topic is enhancing label compliance through international standards. So in this first webinar, we will cover the label requirements in various ISO standards, including ISO 13485, ISO 14971, and ISO 15223, as well as the non-ISO labeling international standards and how they can be interpreted to ensure compliance. Our speaker today is Jennifer Sturr. Jennifer is the Senior Manager of Technical Publications and Localization for Accuray. Accuray as a company develops, manufactures and sells radiotherapy systems that make cancer treatments shorter, safer, personalized, and more effective, ultimately enabling patients to live longer, better lives. Jennifer has over 20 years of experience in medical device labeling and localization, and has worked for a variety of companies, including Gambro BCT, Boston Scientific, Thoratec Corporation, and St. Jude Medical. Jennifer also worked on the localization supplier side of the business, assisting life sciences customers with implementation and improvement of XML content management systems and localization processes. I'd like to ask that when you have a question, type it in the little chat area at the bottom of the screen, and then we'll try and answer them at the end of the session. And with this said, let's get started, and we will hand it over to you, Jennifer.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for that introduction. Okay, so thank you again. Thank you everybody for joining today. And this is like I said earlier, this is a pretty text-heavy presentation. So I will do my best to try to liven up the topic. It is enhancing our label compliance through international standards. So one of the things in medical device labeling that is challenging among probably every part of medical device labeling is staying compliant through to the multiple standards that we are required to be compliant to. So I wanted to review some of the main ISO standards and also some of the non-ISO standards that apply to medical device labeling that we need to be considering as we're developing our labeling. And this is something that is such a dynamic area because there are changes to these standards over time, and it's very difficult to, in some instances, to stay up to date on them. So one of the things I wanted to talk through first is the main standard for ISO, which applies to medical device quality management system, and that's 13485. Now, this ISO standard applies to any medical device company that requires the implementation of a quality management system. So this is a very large and diverse standard, and there are a few parts of that apply to labeling. So I just pulled out, for today's presentation, I'm only going to be addressing those components that that apply to labeling. So again, very large standard, only a couple that apply to us, but still very important. And then also ISO 14971, which is risk management. So, and again, a large standard, but only talking about the safety component of it, where we have to reflect those caution and warning statements within the IFU. So I'm going to start out with 13485. So section 4 of 13485 talks about document control. And the document control also includes any type of document that you're writing that supports the development of a medical device. So this is not only the end user documentation, but any documentation that you're using to create for the design history file, for the master record, for anything that is going to be documenting that medical device. But labeling, so IFUs, product labels, anything that ships with the product, in some cases, quick reference guides. Kind of depends on how you're approaching it on your product. They need to go under and be controlled under the standard 1345 document control. So what this includes is a review and approval of all documents before it's used, and always ensuring that the current versions are available. So this is the ECO process. This is the way that we are implementing, releasing our documentation and making sure that we have the correct approval cycles and all of those kinds of those pieces. So that requirement for an ECO is actually driven from 1345 Section 4. 1345 also talks about risk management. So it requires that an organization will establish a documented requirement for risk management. And actually called out within the standard is that you use your labeling to mitigate risk. So in order for you to ensure that your product is being used correctly, that needs to be included within the product labeling. So this is something that is very difficult in some cases to capture everything during the development, especially on new products that aren't released yet, because sometimes you don't know the level of risk you're going to be assuming with a particular product. So this is another reason why our labeling is always in the constant state of update, because additional risks are identified and you have to mitigate that within your labeling. And so, and the risk management does apply to all of your processes, including your quality system processes, but it also goes back down all the way through device design, manufacturing, and support. So depending on how your company is structured and where your labeling processes are managed, the level of this application is, that's how you determine that. So for example, at Accuray, the labeling department, our technical publications group, is in research and development, which is very strongly controlled by risk management processes. So we have a much stringent approach to labeling and documenting our risk for our labeling. I've worked in other organizations where we were not part of R&D and we had a little bit less of a concentration of risk management. So this actually, I think, is a very, it really depends on the organization, as well as how much your organization wants to include risk management in the labeling, documenting it and part of the labeling. So when we get into the Q&A, I would be interested to hear from the participants, you know, some more additional information around how you're handling this, because I think this is one of the areas that is most ambiguous, to be honest, and also one that I don't think is a very, there's not a formal way to do this that's well documented across the industry of labeling. So again, this is a great conversation and probably an entire webinar on its own on how to handle that. The other component of 1345 that impacts labeling is design control. So when you have a product development process, you need to follow the design control requirements, which starts with establishing what is the design going to be, what are the requirements and the specifications and the requirements for developing that product, and then validating the design, and then transferring that to manufacturing for development. At Accuray, as I said earlier, we are part of R&D, so our labeling goes through this process to the T. So the requirements for our labeling are derived by system requirements. And then those system requirements drive the content. We do a validation and verification and validation of the label. And then when it's transferred to manufacturing as a part, that label is then active. So labeling is typically driven by design. So understanding how this works is very important. Sorry, I'm getting my pings here. So understanding how labeling is driven is very important there. And again, when we get into the Q&A, I would like to understand from the participants who actually is in R&D and follows this level of scrutiny as well. So that's that part for the design controls. And again, this is also something that's new for me, being in Accuray, because typically when I was in marketing, we didn't get into this level of the application of design requirements for labeling. But it makes a lot of sense, and it really helps to feed back into you know, the requirements of the product, and also then feeds down into risk management. So it's kind of a two-way, kind of the way it goes for two different directions in terms of meeting the design requirement and the risk management. Then another part of ISO 13485 that does apply to labeling as well in a different way is purchasing. So this is something that is interesting from a supplier perspective to know, as well as you know, those of us who are in labeling and know that our products actually need to be produced. So the 1345 has purchasing requirements that give you specific requirements for the types of suppliers that can provide you with services that are going to be part of a medical device. And this has been extended to translation services, materials for producing labeling, product labeling material, etc. So this is one of the reasons why in some cases you need to have multiple translation suppliers, for example, to provide you translations services when you're creating labels. There's been an evolution over time. This wasn't always the case in my experience, where labeling was considered, or translations was considered, a level 1 supplier ranking, which means within purchasing you have different levels of companies or suppliers. So level 1 is considered a very highly scrutinized, audited supplier that provides critical information for or critical services for the medical device. And I would say in the last 6 to 10 years, translation services have been elevated to a level 1 supplier, which means a couple of things. First, it's that the supplier themselves are under a bit more scrutiny during the onboarding process. So when you're selecting translation suppliers, you have to go through a more detailed questionnaire. The translation services providers need to give more information on the level of their compliance to certain standards. So it raises the bar when you're looking at different translation companies. The other thing that it does is it typically will drive the fact that you cannot single source your translations. So in some cases, we would only have one translation supplier providing all of the translation services. But as a level 1 supplier, you typically, most companies will say you have to have more than one. So if you are providing translation services within your organization, I would definitely talk with your supplier management team and find out how they are ranking your translation suppliers. Another piece that will also include are quarterly or yearly audits of your supplier. I've not seen quarterly that often unless there are issues, but usually once a year you need to provide, you need to do an audit of your supplier just to make sure that they're staying within the stated processes that they talked about during the onboarding. So, and again, that's all driven by 13485. The other piece are printing. So your printing suppliers, so anyone who's going to be providing print services, if you are doing print manuals, They need to be part of this. Our print supplier is not considered a level 1, so not that level of scrutiny, but again, just to keep in mind, you know, that when we're looking at these standards, they apply across the board. So then I want to get into a little bit more on content. So those are more, the 1345 kind of drives more of the labeling process. So how are we creating the label? How are we tracking it back to the system requirements? How are we doing? That's more of the process. Now we're going to start talking a little bit more about the standards that apply to the label content. So one of the ones that sometimes isn't necessarily considered because it is not a medical device specific standard, but that's ISO 7000. So ISO 7000 has, and also its counterpart is IEC 6417. And these are the graphical symbols for use on equipment. So this standard is a collection of graphical symbols that can be placed on the equipment to give you more information for use. And so I'm going to talk through a little bit, I think in the next slide, yes. So here is an example of some of the symbols that appear in ISO 7000. And as you see underneath the symbol is a number. So this number can be used for a couple of different purposes. One is when you're ordering them actually from the ISO standard website. If you need to order a high-res version of these symbols, you would order them by the number. But the other thing that we need to start doing that is critical for compliance to these standards now is that you have to reference this number in your symbols table in your IFU. So any symbol that appears on the product or on the product label needs to be defined in the IFU. And that's been a pretty much of a standard, you know, requirement for many years. But most recently, now we need to, the requirement is that you have to reference not only the symbol, but the symbol number and the symbol origin. Where are you getting it from? And I have a sample later on in my presentation of what one of these tables looks like. This one is ISO 15223. This is the symbols for medical devices. So this one is, we probably all have this printed out on our desks on PDF on our hard drives. This one is a very important standard for medical device labeling. It used to be EN 980. EN 980 was replaced by ISO 15223, and the most recent version is 2016. So it was revised. So there are some of the symbols that you will see, the instructions for use, the do not reuse, you know, does not contain latex, the manufacturing symbol, the sterile, and the temperature limit. So these all are origin of EN 980 15223. And again, when you're putting these into your symbols tables, you do need to include a reference to the standard and the revision of the standard. There is another one out that was 2014. So just make sure that you have the most recent version when you're looking at which symbols to use. Another important standard that is not ISO but is very important is the 6061. And this one has identifies that labeling is considered a critical component of the medical device. And so therefore you need to create a comprehensive list of requirements for marking and labeling. And here are some samples of those symbols that come from 6061. And a lot of these, in my experience, have been, I worked for a company that made implantable heart pumps, and so there's a lot of heart-related defibrillation type of symbols within this standard. So this one doesn't necessarily apply across the medical device world, but it's very important to review these and make sure that you are using these if they apply to your product. Another one that is pretty important to know and understand and review is the IEC TR 6878, which is graphical symbols for electrical equipment in medical practice. This is another one that is not necessarily high on everyone's list of saying, oh yes, we have to make sure that we're compliant with this standard, but it is very important that you are reviewing your symbols against this one as well. So this one I would look up and start to review this. I actually did this with one of my tech writers earlier this summer, and we found quite a few actually that we should be using that we are not, so we have changed that. So this one was one that I think is important for us to put as high actually on the list as 15223. So I wanted to give you a quick example of what a symbols table should look like within your labeling, within your IFU. And so this actually shows the reference. So you would want to say what is the standard, what is the symbol, and what is the number next to each one of the standards, the symbols that you're referring to. And this is going to be, in my opinion, you know, it's just one of those things that we have to do in medical device labeling, but it could become a real issue with updating and keeping it up to date, because these standards do change, the symbols do change. But I also think that as long as you have the reference and which standard you're using, it's important that it's then you do have a traceability. The one criticism I do have of this particular symbols table is that it doesn't say the year, and I think that's very important. So for example, here ISO 15223, I would actually put -1:2016, so that it's very clear which version of the standard you're using, so that even if there is an update, that you can have confirmation that, you know, you were up to date at the time it was printed, and, you know, you can then kind of work in the updates. Because if you're saying just ISO 15223 and this symbol changes, then you're out of compliance. But in my opinion, if you have 15223:2016 and this symbol changes in the 2020 version, then you're still quote unquote in compliance because you're referencing the correct version, and it gives you a little bit of buffer time to be able to update that symbol when you have the time. The other piece to remember is that to be sure that these symbols reflect back to your product label, and being sure that you're using the consistent product labeling symbols. And one thing I want to address, I don't have a slide that speaks to this specifically, but I've been asked many times, how do you know which requirement to follow? So I'm just going to back up a minute. So there are instances where these standards may be they may be conflicting. So you may have a symbol within this standard that says this is what you use for the latex. I think the instructions for use is a good example. ISO 15223 says you need to have this as your instructions for use symbol. 6061 says you need to have the blue guy, which we all call the blue guy. I don't have a copy of the blue guy on here, but it is the round symbol. It's a person looking at a book, and it has to be printed in blue, and that's the standard that drives that requirement. Well, they're both the same, so which one do you use? And I get that question quite a bit. And usually the way that you resolve something like that when you have conflicting requirements is I bring in systems engineering, and I bring in regulatory to help determine that. You know, you always can put both. So we actually put both of these symbols on our labels and in our symbol stock, because that way you're covered. And as long as you are saying this is we're using this graphic from 15223 and we're using this graphic from 6061, you're covered. But there are instances where you're going to have conflicting information in these standards, and you just need to work that out within your internal teams to help decide which one you're going to use or how to stay compliant. So that is the end of my formal presentation. I would be happy to start taking questions. I can't see the question box if there are any, but I'm happy to start opening the discussion up to talk through the standards.
Okay, so I'm looking, there are no questions right now, but if you guys want to type questions, that'd be great, or you can jump in and ask your questions as well, I think.
Hi, Jennifer, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Jenny, and I work with a IVD medical device company. So very often we have very small tubes, and so we're always struggling to put, you know, the symbols and all the required language on the tube. Do you know of any standards that speak to minimum font size? Because I was unable to find any. And in fact, like for UDI, it just says a human readable size, but it doesn't give you much, you know, it doesn't give you a lot of definition as to what the human readable is. I just wondered if you know of any industry-wide standard font size that's human readable, or if you know of any references to anywhere in the standards.
Yeah, actually, the only one, that's a great question, because I think we all struggle with that one. The only one I've been able to find is from the FDA. And
okay, yeah, so that's it too, yeah.
Yeah, that's the only one that I've been able to find, and I believe it's 6.6 or
okay.
Point is or I can't remember if they say 6 point or no less than 5, but I can help find that for you. I have not seen any international standard that speaks to that. So
okay,
I've just
thank you.
FDA one, yeah.
Okay.
Do we have any other questions?
Hi, I just typed a question, but I'm not seeing it in the chat. My name is Jamie. I had a question about the do not reuse symbol. For our company, we have dispensers that have 50 or 100 dispenses, but we want to indicate that you can't refill a dispenser. So is it proper to use the do not reuse symbol, or are we using it incorrectly for something that has multiple dispenses? We're kind of running into some confusion on how to use that symbol.
Okay, so is it, can you use multiple doses per patient?
So this goes on to an instrument. You don't use, it's a dispense for slide staining, and so you might have 50 slides go in, and you would have, you know, 50 drops come out of a dispenser. But I think what our understanding historically has been to say, hey, you can't refill this dispenser. But we've had some people raise some questions of like, well, that's not actually what that symbol means. So you could theoretically have multiple uses per patient, but I'm not sure that we're understanding the intent of that symbol very well. And so I don't know if I'm explaining the situation very well.
Following you, yes. So because there's actually two different ones. There's do not reuse, and then there's also and I'm blanking on it. It isn't in 15223, and the intent behind that one is do not reuse on more than one patient. So that one may be more in line with what your application is. And I can Jamie, I can get your information and we can chat if you'd like offline, because I've had that situation where you have like a reusable, some type of a reusable kit or component that you can use on the same patient multiple times, but then you can't reuse with another patient, right? So that may be a better application than do not reuse.
Or maybe we shouldn't be indicating anything if it's, I mean, because this isn't necessarily something that that would be restricted from patient to patient. You could have 50 different patient samples in an instrument. So then you would have 50 different drops coming out. And so technically you would have 50 patients potentially. So I'm wondering if maybe we are being a little too cautious and not fully understanding that symbol. But that's been one of our issues lately, is trying to understand the do not reuse.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. So a lot of these are for patient facing, right?
Yeah.
So you know, the latex one that I have displayed, the do not reuse, is for anything that is patient facing. If you're using assays or things like that you know are within your own within the manufacturing process or the lab process within a hospital, not quite sure that it would apply. But that is a tough one, right? I mean, because you're still responsible for the proper use of the equipment. But I would probably say, in your case, how I would handle that is say, this is how we're going to apply the use of this symbol, and then just document it in one of your SOPs or work instructions.
Oh, okay.
Get rid of that, you know, you just get rid of that ambiguity and say, you know, in our case, we're going to use the 2 with the line through it, which means do not reuse after 50 applications or something like that.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? And then that way, if it's in your SOP, then that kind of gets rid of that ambiguity and just defines how your company is going to use that.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you, Jamie, for the question. Jennifer, we have one other question here. What is the requirement to use any of these standards regarding symbols, like, for example, ISO 15223? Is it not sufficient to meet the ISO 13485 and 14975 requirements to use relevant symbols and define what these symbols mean within an IFU?
Is it not, I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the question. Is it not
sufficient to meet the ISO 13485 and 14971 requirements to use relevant symbols and define what these symbols mean within an IFU?
Well, you have to do that, right? You have to define. Okay, so I think I'm not quite understanding the question. Let me see if I can answer this. You don't have to use the symbols. It's not a requirement to use the symbol, but if you're going to use a symbol, you really should use a harmonized symbol, which is out of 15223. If you're not using a harmonized symbol, then you have to define it actually on the label itself, which then requires translation. So it's kind of this circular argument, right? So, but there isn't a requirement that says you have to use 15223. But if you're going to use symbols to represent content, then you should be using the standard. Does that answer the question?
I believe so. This was a question from Joe, and he just said yes. So
okay. Yep. Great.
All right. I don't see any other questions in our little chat box here, but if anybody else wants to jump in, we still have a little bit of time. No? Then I think we might be done here. Well, Jennifer, thank you so very much for the presentation and answering the questions. We really, really appreciate it. And wish everybody a great rest of the day or evening for those of you in Europe. Thanks again for attending.